Hello, everyone. This is Brian Frederick with the ALS Association. We are going to get started very soon. We're excited for day 3 of our conference. We're doing just a bit of an audio check here to make sure everything sounds okay. We have some wonderful programming today. We're really excited to bring to you some speakers and some guests speaking about preventing or delaying the harms of ALS. We'll also touch on some of the programming from Tuesday, which was finding new treatments and cures. So be sure to chat your questions in as we go. Don't feel like you need to wait to the end of a speaker. If you have any questions, chat them in. And we look forward to another great day today. Thanks to y'all.
Hi, folks. My name is Jason Crow, Congressman from Colorado. As a co-chair of the ALS caucus, I want to thank you all for having me and for all the ALS groups, researchers, and countless advocates I've met over the years who continue the fight to find a cure for ALS. Since I came to Congress, I have always been inspired by the strength you all draw on, leveraging your own personal experiences to bring about lasting, once-in-a-generation change. I know firsthand the shock and pain a diagnosis can bring to families. But you all have transformed the pain of that diagnosis into meaningful grassroots advocacy dedicated to inspiring a better future. A future where husbands, wives, mothers, fathers, sisters, and brothers don't have to experience the pain of ALS. Although I know some efforts may seem small or movements too slow, know that each personal story, each Zoom meeting, and each long day running from office to office plays a part of a larger movement. A movement that inspires Congress members, their staff, and the next generation of advocates to dedicate themselves to this cause, a cause that is far greater than just one of us, but it needs all of us. The hard work of your advocacy has brought us a long way. As you all know, just this past year, Congress came together and reached across partisan lines to overwhelmingly pass the Act for ALS, which one, expands treatments for rapidly progressing diseases beyond their ongoing clinical trials, two, allows for additional research for new interventions, and three, creates a new rare disease grant program to support other ALS research. Simply put, this law is a game changer, and your dedication and hard work made it happen. Of course, all the Act for ALS is a great achievement. We all know that it's only a first step in the right direction. We must do more. This is why the House ALS caucus is committed to pushing further and doing more. Together, we will continue to work with you all to raise awareness about the challenges ALS patients and their families face. We will think creatively about policy solutions to reduce the negative impact of ALS and invest in groundbreaking research to end ALS once and for all. It's time that we expand our efforts, like improving equity in clinical trials and expanding access to telehealth services beyond the public health emergency. There's so much work still to be done, but it's abundantly clear to me, and I hope to everyone in the room today, that the victories of our past and our future aren't possible without you. I want to thank each and every one of the volunteers and constituent advocates again for the incredible things that you have accomplished. I hope the rest of the night is full of great conversation with friends, fond memories of loved ones, and above all else, hope for the future. Thanks again, and tomorrow, let's get to work.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to day 3 of the 2022 National ALS Advocacy Conference. My name is Ken Minkhouse. And it's my pleasure to introduce day 3. I am a professor of political science at Davidson College in North Carolina. I'm also a member of the ALS Association Board of Trustees. And third, I am a person living with ALS diagnosed in 2018. I'd like to share just a few thoughts with you, wearing each of those 3 hats for just a moment. First, as a person living with ALS, I'd like to thank you. Your advocacy has been critical in so many victories and advances in recent years. These advances and victories are not only very important for those of us who are living with ALS now, but for the more than 1 million Americans who are alive today who don't yet have ALS, but who will be diagnosed at some point in their lifetime. The advances, the progress that we are making in this generation is going to be seen with great gratitude by those future generations. So you're doing tremendous work, not just for those of us who have ALS now, but for a whole raft of people into the future. Secondly, as a Board of Trustee member, I am serving on Care Services Committee, on the Public Policy Committee, and the Research Committee this year. And that's given me a vantage point to see the importance of advocacy across all of those domains. We often think of advocacy as principally asking the government for more resources and money for research. And of course, that is critically important. But it's not just that. There are a lot of policies There are a lot of laws. There are a lot of procedures that put in place across the government at both the national and the state level that have enormous impact on the quality of life for people with ALS and their caregivers, and the kind of support we can come to expect from the government. So that's a really important part of what we do. And then third, if I could speak for just a second as a political scientist, we political scientists study interest groups and advocacy very, very closely. And one of the questions that we always ask ourselves is, what makes advocacy relatively more or less effective? Because there's thousands of groups asking the government to do this or that. Some succeed and some don't. And it's not just the number of people who are reaching out to their representatives. It's not just how loud the organizations are. The most effective advocacy is a combination of grassroots mobilization and voice with strategy, with good asks, with innovative new policies that capture people's attention, with successful framing of issues, and with coalition building. And I want to say that because it's important both to recognize what you're doing in mobilizing for these key issue areas in ALS, but also to thank the team of staff members working on these issues in the ALS Association and in other ALS organizations for providing that broader architecture within which we mobilize and advocate. It's that combination of us and them working together that is really going to bring some effective changes to policies that are going to affect both our lives, the lives of caregivers, and hopefully advance research very quickly for treatments and a cure for ALS. Again, welcome to the day. And with that, I'm going to turn the floor over. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. I really appreciate that introduction and all the service that you've given to the association and to the ALS community. Our volunteers provide not only leadership, but guidance and key advice on lots of different and difficult situations. So thank you for that. I do want to bring us into day 3. I'm very excited to be sharing with you a whole bunch of new material that you haven't seen before. So if we can go to the next slide, please. I first want to thank our sponsors, Amylyx, Apellis, Biogen, Biohaven Pharmaceuticals, Cytokinetics, Genentech, Mitsubishi Tanabe, Pharma America, Sanofi, and Tranquis Therapeutics. They, and if you go to the next slide, as along with our silver and bronze level sponsors, are vital for helping get this conference together, as well as supporting lots of different options throughout the year, as well as our day-to-day work, which is to find new treatments for ALS, as well as to deliver high-quality products to people that we all depend on. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Again, to remind you, what we're trying to do through this advocacy conference and through everything we're doing at the association is to achieve a rapid and a fundamental transformation in the ALS experience, to make it livable, to help people live dramatically longer lives, dramatically improved quality of life, and to help prevent new cases of ALS. And so until we can get there, until we can find cures to make ALS go away altogether, we're focusing on finding new treatments and cures as quickly as possible, optimizing current treatments and care so we can get the best value, the best use out of the technologies that are available, and help push the technology for assistive technology that help people engage with the world and move around and function. And then also to not only prevent ALS itself, but to treat as early as possible to help delay the onset or even stop the onset of new symptoms, and to prevent the harms associated with ALS that come with it. The pain, the emotional and social stress, the isolation, the poverty, all the financial challenges. These are all things that we have to work on explicitly, and work on with a real sense of urgency, and convey to our elected officials that not only are we looking to have a fundamental transformation in ALS, but that transformation is possible, that we have a strategy to get there, and we just have to remain focused and diligent on those things. So I would like to move into our conversation today. If we go into the next slide, please.
We're going to be talking about all three of those arms today. We're going to have a wonderful conversation from Kyle Zebley, who I'll introduce shortly, talking about telehealth. We're going to be talking about how to reduce complications of ALS with Dr. Hyman Patterson. We're going to hear a nice conversation from Representative Eshu and Scott Kaufman, our chair, talk about some advocacy and have some experiences from advocates and some more stories. Should be very interesting. We're also going to hear a pre-recorded conversation with Dr. Paganoni talking about new treatments for ALS. This is something we did on our first day that we weren't able to share with you. And then a quick conversation with Steve Kowalski, also talking about advocacy. We're going to have opportunities here and there for Q&A. So if you have questions for speakers, please type them into the chat as they come in, and Jeremy will queue up the speakers for those conversations. So as I said, it's going to be a full session. We have a lot going. We are going to go over our initial time to make up for the time that we missed on day one. And so that's the additional content from Sabrina and from Steve. And of course, if you can't stay, that's all right. We'll find a way to get this stuff on the web quickly so you can review this afterwards if that's easier for you. So I'd like to introduce Kyle Zebley, our first speaker for the day. He is the Vice President of Public Policy at the American Telemedicine Association. And in his role, he's trying to eliminate barriers to the expansion of telehealth so that patients and providers and payers can realize the benefits of virtual care. And he's worked in the Department of Health and Human Services, as well as on Capitol Hill. And Kyle, thank you so much for coming to join us.
Great, thanks so much. And it's a real honor to be with everyone today and really take part in what is such an important activity, which is really letting policymakers at both the federal level and at the state level understand the needs of the communities like the ALS community that are relying on telehealth services to receive clinically appropriate care. And so it's a real joy for me every day to be out here in Washington, D.C. and in state capitals to let policymakers know of our top objectives. So if we could just bring up our PowerPoint presentation, I'll march through a few high-level issues, and then we'll give you some time to ask some questions towards the end of the presentation. Our vision at the ATA is a simple one. We've been around since 1993 during the early pioneering days of telehealth and telemedicine. And what we're simply trying to do is allow for the safe and appropriate care to be delivered wherever people are so that we can do more good for more people. And that's the full potential of telehealth. That's the full potential of telemedicine. It's not much more complicated than that. Next slide, please. We represent a really diverse and big tent membership in the ATA, really the width and breadth of the US healthcare system. And we have all come together under the Big Ten umbrella of the ATA to ensure that that vision is met of ensuring all Americans have access to clinically appropriate care where they need it. Next slide. As we go and talk to policymakers, there are several considerations that we all should keep in mind that really will give you a good basis for your advocacy so that you have a good grounding as to the issues at play for those that want to make sure that Americans and folks battling with ALS and living with ALS have the tools they need for virtual care. Next slide. A couple of things really important to keep in mind. Where are there levers of power, and how can you pull those levers of power if you're a federal policymaker or state policymaker to ensure that that care is assured? And really it's very distinct. And when we're making asks, it's good to understand what the purview of the federal government is and what the purview of the state government is in the practice and the payment of telehealth. At the federal level, it's really important to know that in terms of the standard of care and the practice of medicine, that's by and large not the purview of the federal government. That's the purview of the states. And so if you're asking for something to be deemed clinically appropriate or restrictions on standard of care to be removed, you really need to focus those conversations at the state level. However, the federal government does have broad purview in a few specific areas. In terms of remote prescribing of controlled substances, prescriptions that could be handled virtually, the Drug Enforcement Administration and Congress in general really wield significant authority in that specific area. When you're talking about health data and health information, they're governed by federal law through HIPAA. If you're talking about the approval of pharmaceutical products or medical devices or connected devices that are linked up to telehealth services, of course, you have to go through the Food and Drug Administration. And when you talk about how to stop anti-competitive actions that perhaps are keeping telehealth locked out of marketplaces, the Federal Trade Commission is has significant authority in that area. In terms of the payment, there's a huge role that the federal government can play, particularly if you're receiving care through Medicare, particularly if you're trying to remove what states can do and what states can cover through the Medicaid program. If you're the huge number of Americans that receive their care in part through the Veterans Health Administration, if you're receiving care through the Indian Health Service, if you're an active member of the military or have a family member through the TRICARE healthcare program, all of those programs have a very set payment structure, and the federal government can really wield its significant authority in determining what is and will not be paid for. And also, as you think about certain restrictions that are embedded in the law that had been huge obstacles prior to the pandemic that were embedded in the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, again, you can keep in mind that there have been other restrictions on reimbursement that have been obstacles that have to be cleared up at the federal level. Next slide, please. At the state level, really for a lot of our members, and important for everyone to know, at the state level, that's where folks can live or die based on what they can and can't do in the practice of medicine. This is where decisions are made about what are acceptable telehealth modalities. What's the tech you can use to deliver healthcare? Who can deliver that care? Is it only physicians, or can other medical professions do that? That's a determination made by state legislators and regulators. How do you establish a patient-provider relationship? Can you establish a new patient-provider relationship with all the requirements that entails and all that allows via telehealth? By and large, you can, but that was a decision that state legislatures had to make on their own. And really importantly, and this has become extraordinarily important during the pandemic, can out-of-state licensed medical professionals deliver care to you in state? And what are the requirements that it takes for an out-of-state practitioner and provider to deliver care to you in a state in question? When we think about the huge healthcare provider shortage, eliminating interstate barriers to care is a huge priority for the ATA and telehealth advocates. And then also laws governing what Medicaid and also what commercial insurance plans can and cannot cover, what they must cover, restrictions about coverage and reimbursement, and other parameters around that issue. Those are all decisions made at the state level. Next slide, please. We have answers to all of these questions, and each one could really take a presentation perhaps in and of themselves. But as we go out and talk to policymakers, know that we are, as an issue, telehealth is going to be very well received. It's been really perceived as a game changer during the pandemic. We've got support in every state in the country. We've got bipartisan support. We had support in the Trump administration. We've got support in the Biden administration. It's a very unique issue. I wouldn't want to trade places with anybody else in terms of advocating on a healthcare issue, because telehealth has really been universally accepted and promoted by policymakers. However, if there is going to be any concerns that they might have, there might be questions that really come up in these buckets. Maybe telehealth is more prone to fraud, waste, and abuse. It's going to lead to overcosts and overutilization. It could increase disparities. by not being available to everybody or only having telehealth available to certain communities without the ability for in-person care. There are those that are naysayers out there that really worry, is this high quality care? Is it clinically appropriate to do a variety of services via telehealth? And what about that continuity of care? Is there going to be an interruption of the continuity of care if you put telehealth in the mix? We have answers to all these questions. At the end of the day, telehealth is health. It's not something separate and apart. The same standard of care that applies in person has to apply virtually. And yet we do have to do some handholding and walk through the answers to these common misconceptions that policymakers might have. And there's lots of resources available at ATA. I know ALS, of course, will have lots of resources how to talk through why we're promoting the need to access virtual care services. But just be prepared to answer these questions as you talk to policymakers. Next slide, please. And so oftentimes when these misconceptions come up, that means that you're going to have to be have data and peer-reviewed studies and research prepared. You have to fight back against clinically inappropriate barriers to care, such as in-person requirement guardrails. You have to make sure that policymakers don't take that misconceptions and use them as justification to limit access to telehealth through specific services or modalities. These concerns are unfounded, or they're no more apparent in virtual care than in in-person care. We've got to make sure that folks understand that this has now been done for decades, even if it's only come into the public consciousness over the last couple of years, and that every provider group, every major patient group at the federal level, at the state level, are supportive of telehealth as a way to deliver clinically appropriate care. So let's not overthink this, is the bottom line to policymakers. Let's trust our providers to make the best decisions in working with their patients and informing their patients as to what can be done virtually and what cannot be done virtually. Next slide. We'll quickly just talk through some high-level federal policy issues. Next slide. For us, we seek to remove arbitrary Medicare restrictions. Again, that's the biggest lever that the federal government can pull. Very few Medicare beneficiaries had access to virtual care prior to the pandemic. Right now they do, but that's temporary in nature. We as advocates want to make sure that's made permanent. We also want to remove in-person requirements like that which is found for telemental health that will take effect at the end of the public health emergency. And we want to make sure those in-person requirements, which are clinically inappropriate barriers to care, aren't repeated for other services. We want to maximize advantages for access to telehealth through various tax provisions for high deductible health plans, and to make sure that telehealth is considered an accepted benefit to increase access to care for Americans receiving those kinds of services. We want to make sure that, again, talking about that DEA lever I talked about earlier, that there is continued ability for remote prescription of controlled substances. And we also, while doing all these core priorities, have to make sure that we're keeping track of a myriad number of other issues in this kind of additional priority section that will maximize the level of penetration for telehealth in federal programs. Next slide, please. We had a big win as a community, and telehealth advocates had a big win a couple of months ago in a federal omnibus spending bill that really locks in those Medicare Part B telehealth flexibilities that are a huge priority for us for 151 days post public health emergency. That forestalls the implementation of the telemental health in-person requirement, that re-ups for the rest of this calendar year that high deductible health plan issue, and that really urges various agencies to finalize their reports that are ongoing so that Congress can make a more permanent decision as to what the future of telehealth will look like at the federal level. Left out, which we really have to hammer home for those that are receiving clinically appropriate controlled substances via telehealth, left out of that was that in-person waiver continuation. So that has obviously jumped to the top of our list of priorities. Next slide, please. Now I'm just going to really briefly hammer home some issues that are really important at the state level. Next slide. If you know one state's telehealth policies, frankly speaking, you know one state's telehealth policies. There is a huge degree of variation in legislation and regulation of telehealth at the state level. Yes, there are trends. But state governments have extraordinary purview to do lots of different things for good or ill at the state level. So really you need to care at the state level, because if they muck it up at the state level, doesn't matter what the federal government's going to do for you if you're not going to be able to receive clinically appropriate care via telehealth. And that includes, again, the idea of what the practice standards are, definitions that are so important around utilization of telehealth, what are permissible, that licensure issue again, what your state Medicaid agency for underserved populations is going to cover and get reimbursed for, and that establishment of the patient-provider relationship. Next slide. We had a huge positive change during the pandemic at the state level. If so much is temporary in nature and not yet permanent at the federal level, really in most states, the opposite's true. Most states have now updated their laws after the pandemic in regards to telehealth, and they've done it in a positive way. And so we really achieved record gains in a very short amount of time. Last year, we had 28 states pass positive telehealth policies into law. So far this year, we're up to 9 states that have done the same, with only one exception, that in Alabama, which I won't go into right now. We've had nothing but wins on the board. So going into 2022, what's really been important to us is just protecting that level of gains, making sure we don't go backwards, and the forces that oppose telehealth, which largely want to go back to the way the healthcare system was structured prior to the pandemic in terms of brick and mortar based care, don't take away and chip away at those gains. And that means that we have to keep on talking as advocates to medical boards and regulators and state legislators, make sure they're educated about the full scope of telehealth capabilities, and that we continue to pay attention to other ways to increase access to care, like the licensure compacts that allow for the practice of medicine and other medical specialties across state lines, like modality neutral frameworks that allow for the provider to determine the appropriate technology in the delivery of care for patients, and like ensuring that we have acceptable reimbursement so that that providers know that there's skin in the game, that there's an inducement to delivering these needed services to patients, like those patients that are dealing with ALS or other kinds of diseases, other kinds of conditions that really require access as much as possible to virtual care services. Next slide. And just on that issue, I briefly talked about, there are a variety of compacts, over 7 compacts that are broken down by medical profession. And if your state legislature adopts that compact, other states that are a part of that compact will then have their providers, their medical professionals that are part of that compact, have the ability to practice in the states that have adopted the compact. This is a great way to break down those interstate barriers. The ATA is supportive of all the various compacts, and we continue to try to chip away at making sure that states adopt as many as possible. Those states in bright orange are those that have adopted the highest number of the compacts, and as you kind of get lower and lower in your color vibrancy, those are states that have adopted less. Unfortunately, there are some states in gray that for one reason or another have not adopted any compacts, and they're of course huge states for us to really inform legislators of the opportunities they're missing out on by not ensuring there are more providers that can deliver clinically appropriate care there within their state's borders. And with that, I think we're ready to answer any questions that you might have, and thank you so much for this opportunity.
Kyle, thank you for that. That was great and incredibly thorough. And I'm excited to kind of moderate a little Q&A session with you, and I appreciate your time in doing so. I want to start with something that you said a moment ago, which is protecting the gains. What are the biggest barriers that you see that are preventing us from making telehealth, expanded access to telehealth permanent?
At the federal level, it's lack of permanency. All of those items that were included in under the public health emergency as flexibilities, all those things that have now been included in that federal omnibus spending bill I mentioned that was passed a few months ago, are all temporary. And at some point or another, if Congress doesn't act, the ALS community and the rest of America that relies on telehealth services through these federal programs and federal flexibilities will go off what we call the telehealth cliff. Yes, this is a bipartisan issue. Yes, we had support with President Trump and now have support with President Biden. But because of the dysfunction and the gridlock in Washington, D.C., even getting popular bipartisan issues across the finish line and signed into law is a Herculean task. And so we cannot have enough advocates and patients and everyday citizens pick up the phone, call their member of Congress, send letters of communication to administration officials and to President Biden and Vice President Harris to say, what are you doing to make these programs permanent? Relieve the stress that we are all feeling that it's not permanent. And let's make these commonsensical changes so that the telehealth access that is available now is here now and into the future. And then at the state level, I would say that one of the big concerns is the folks that might adopt so-called guardrails that don't allow for telehealth to really offer its full potential. And what I mean by that is in-person requirements, brick and mortar requirements that are arbitrary barriers to care. We've removed a lot of them, but those that again want to go back to the way the healthcare system used to look and that look at patients as market share are very creative in trying to plug these in to really limit that access and force folks to go into care in person when they might not have to and when they don't have the luxury of the flexibility of telehealth that does that clinically appropriate care. So those are some of the major barriers. And then of course, we got to keep on chipping away on the barriers embedded in the licensure law. There's lots of good reasons why we want to have accountability for medical providers, but we shouldn't allow them to be protectionist reasons to keep licensed medical professionals in good standing from out of state from allowing telehealth services to patients and citizens in the state in question.
Thinking about you talked about the effectiveness of advocacy and really pressing lawmakers. It sounds like from your perspective, there's an appetite amongst lawmakers for expanded and permanent access. We have a question about resources that may or may not that could be available to inform advocates about the telehealth laws that exist, particularly in different states, and how they can use that in terms of preparing for meetings with members of Congress or at the state level.
Right. Well, of course, at americantelemed.org, which is the ATA's website, we've got a very active policy page that we update regularly that has legislative trackers for both federal policy and state policy, and letters on federal and state specific legislative or regulatory acts. And that I hope it would be helpful. If you also go to cchp.org, it's a telehealth resource center based in California, but they do a state by state analysis of every state's laws regarding modalities and reimbursement and various other areas that allow for the reader to really get a full understanding of every differentiation in the area of telehealth on a state-by-state basis. It's extraordinarily comprehensive, and it's a great resource if you're looking for just the facts. But if you're looking for advocacy items, would suggest americantelemed.org.
I'm going to try to sneak one last question in here before I have to let you go. A lot of folks in the community have some technology challenges. Do you know of resources that are available for tech support as we're thinking about using technology to access telehealth?
Well, there would be tech support offered by every insurer, whether they're commercial insurer or public insurer, that really could help the beneficiary walk through what is necessary in order to take full advantage of the services offered by that insurer. But also, I just want to put in a plug for advocacy in response to that. There is a lot of technological limitations out there, really for socioeconomic, demographic, or geographic. And that's why the ATA is very modality neutral, tech neutral, because, for instance, audio only might be the only way for folks to receive clinically appropriate care virtually in their home without going in person, if they don't have access for those variety of reasons I mentioned earlier. And that's why it's so important to keep that flexibility as a permanent part of the US healthcare system post-COVID-19.
Well, Kevin, could talk to you for another hour and would enjoy every minute of it, but we are going to have to wrap this segment here. If we didn't get to your questions, we'll try to answer them offline, but let's see. Thanks. Let's hear a quick message from Congressman Mike Gallagher.
Hi, everyone. Mike Gallagher here. It's an honor to be able to speak with you today, and I hope that you're enjoying the 2022 ALS Advocacy Conference so far. First of all, let me thank you for the work you're doing on behalf of those who've been diagnosed with ALS and all their loved ones. The ALS Association and its supporters provide hope of someday finding a cure to the thousands of patients and their families as they struggle with this difficult diagnosis. Whether ALS has touched you personally or you are the support system for a spouse, a family member, or a friend who has this disease, you understand how life-changing this diagnosis can be. And as you all know, ALS is tragically fast-moving, which makes it all the more important that patients receive a prompt diagnosis and timely access to potential treatments. I know that our regulatory process often does not match the urgency of many life-threatening and oftentimes fatal diseases, including ALS. We have some of the best medical researchers and drug development technologies in the world, and I believe we must make sure patients can access any potential therapies or treatments quickly. That's why I introduced the Promising Pathway Act, which would ensure that certain life-saving drugs can move through a special approval process under the oversight of the Food and Drug Administration. It would also create a provisional approval pathway for medications that treat diseases where few to no treatment options currently exist, including during pandemics. It also ensures that any drug granted provisional approval is subject to the highest degree of safety standards and a continuous review process. It can be tough to find anything Republicans and Democrats agree upon in Congress currently, but fortunately, there is wide bipartisan consensus on this issue. So I will continue to work with my colleagues on either side of the aisle and my friends at the ALS Association to ensure that no ALS patient goes without proper care or treatment, and with the hope that someday we will find a cure for this disease. Again, thank you for inviting me to speak. And thank you for all of your hard work. Have a great rest of your day.
And now we're going to welcome Dr. Terry Hyman Patterson. Dr. Hyman Patterson directs the MDA ALS Center of Hope, including the clinical and laboratory research programs. She's also director at the Center for Neurodegenerative Disorders and a professor in the Department of Neurology at the Lewis Katz School of Medicine at Temple University. Dr. Hyman Patterson, thanks for being with us. Dr. Hyman Patterson, I think you might be on mute.
I might be. Thank you. I wanted to thank you for that introduction and also for the privilege of coming here to talk about something that I'm really passionate about, which is care in ALS, and really how to do our best and make the most to, if you want to think of it, reduce the complications of ALS. Next slide. So next slide. Good. So, really, we're going to talk a little bit about mitigating ALS and what we can do now and what the gaps are, how we can do it better, what needs to get done so we can really make the most of the tools we have today. Next slide. I always like to sort of review what we're going to talk about. This audience probably doesn't need a review of ALS, but I still like to just summarize and talk about why we should care. Talk about treatment in ALS in general, but focus on some of the areas that we can make huge progress on and already really are making a difference, like respiratory care and nutrition, as well as the unmet need of figuring out how to help people with the burden of disease. And there's really an urgent need to fill these gaps to maximize the tools. Next slide. To begin, we know that the need is urgent. This is a progressive disease of motor neurons. It can start in speech and swallowing about 20% of the time, or the arms and legs, the extremities, and rarely breathing muscles. It's progressive, leading to weakness and inability to move, inability to speak, swallow, and finally to breathe. And while the average lifespan is about 36 months, there is variability. And here in my pictorial, you can see just the changes over a single year. That is an urgent need. The ground is always moving. It's a moving target in caring for people with ALS. The mean age of onset is in the mid-50s. I've seen 18-year-olds and I've seen 90-year-olds. But I think something that really drives home the urgency is to understand that every one of us in this audience has a 1 in 350 to 400 risk of developing this disease sometime in our lives. About 10% have a family history of the disease. Next slide. So now, what can be done? Well, good care. The first thing, it starts from giving the diagnosis and talking about the disease and doing that with compassion and hope. And then entering into multidisciplinary care, which simply means a group of allied health professionals focused on maximizing your independence and quality of life while treating the disease. And much of it is focused on managing symptoms, and that includes mobility and using physical therapy and occupational therapy to enhance your activities of daily living and mobility. Assistive technology can play a huge role. And then there are disease-specific medications like riluzole and Radicava, but I really wanted to focus today on respiratory and nutritional support because of the major differences that treatment and good care have already made, and the gaps that could make our ability to help people with ALS even greater. And also a little bit about emotional support, which is, I think, treating the burden of disease has not gotten enough attention. And of course, the final component of treatment is education. Educating people living with the disease, their families, and the public is so critical. That's what advocacy is about. Letting people know, what does this disease truly mean? Next slide, please. So to start respiratory care, remember you have muscles that breathe in, and when they get weak, you don't ventilate, you don't bring in oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. And if you can't take a deep breath, the little air sacs that do all the work, they collapse. If I can't breathe out because I have muscle weakness, I can't cough and I can't get stuff out of my lungs. And couple that with the upper airway, my mouth and pharynx, that the muscles up here, if they get weak, I can't gag when I have food in my mouth and the food goes down the wrong pipe. I aspirate, that obstructs the airway. It also provides a nidus for infection. And as my swallowing worsens, I don't get enough nutrition. If I don't get enough nutrition, become malnourished and lose weight, I'm going to get weaker faster. So all of this combines to really create a problem. Next slide. So, we assess respiratory function in the clinic following pulmonary functions. And, one of the big gaps is, what's the best way to do this? What's the best measurement? And, we did a large study looking at breathing tests and found that expiratory muscles get weak first, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's the most sensitive measure. And we need more study about what is the most sensitive measure to indicate when we should implement additional care. And also we evaluate symptoms, shortness of breath, which is dyspnea, fatigue, confusion from CO2 retention, the inability to lay flat, which is what orthopnea is because our diaphragm is weak, waking up in the morning with a headache because CO2 is building or yawning. And so we ask those symptoms, and we also have developed some functional scores. And we recently published on the ARIES, ALS respiratory score. Next slide. And this score is something that the person living with ALS does themselves. It correlates with the breathing test called FVC. It correlates to our functional rating score, the ALS, FRS, and respiratory domains. And it can be administered by telephone, which means in this day and age, as we're developing telemedicine and remote medicine, it's something that could be used in that setting to assess respiratory function. Next slide. And so what do we do to manage respiratory complications? Because it's really important, because we need to prevent and treat infections, because that can throw someone over the edge. And so we need to do vaccinations, nowadays COVID, but also flu and pneumovac. If somebody gets infected who has ALS and respiratory muscle weakness, aggressive treatment with antibiotics and what we call pulmonary clearance that I'll talk about, because I think it's so important. Implementing a feeding tube at the right time. If I'm aspirating and food is getting into my lungs, the less food I put in my mouth, the better. And so putting in a feeding tube earlier may be important for people with swallowing difficulties. And also, if I wait too long to put in a feeding tube and my respiratory status is going down, I might not be able to tolerate that conscious sedation to get the tube placed. We need to control secretions. And one of the more exciting things, I think, is that we can do something early in the disease to strengthen respiratory muscles so that there's a longer period before I need to implement non-invasive breathing and some of these other modalities. And that's with expiratory muscle training and breath stacking. And it's been shown that it improves muscle strength and also swallowing function. It can be very valuable as a tool to prolong your ability to breathe well. And then, of course, ventilation at the proper time, non-invasively, and modalities for respiratory clearance. Next slide. And respiratory clearance is really important if you have a lot of secretions, if your expiratory muscles are getting weak, or certainly if you have an infection. And it's really aimed at mobilizing stuff in your lungs and getting it out when your muscles are too weak to cough. And it includes usually nebulizer to moisten the secretions, pulmonary percussion or a vest to get those secretions up into the large airways, and then to help your cough using a cougholator or insufflator to pull them up and suction as needed. Next slide. In addition, there'll come a time if your breathing deteriorates and you're starting to retain CO2 or getting short of breath, where we want to implement non-invasive ventilation. This has been shown to help with fatigue, to help you oxygenate better and get rid of CO2. It splints open the upper airway, and that decreases the work of breathing and pushes air into your lungs, and that reduces the fatigue from trying to inspire. And it re-expands those air sacs that may have collapsed. And as I said, it prevents carbon dioxide from building up. Next slide. It's been shown to improve the symptoms of respiratory failure like fatigue and shortness of breath, even help with speech. It's shown to improve quality of life. It can improve cognitive function, but most importantly, it has a survival benefit that's better than any of the medicines that we have now, like Radicava and Riluzole, adding 11 to 15 months in larger studies, prolonging survival. Next slide. And what are the gaps? I've already implied some of them. What's the best way to look for respiratory muscle weakness and know when to start that non-invasive ventilator, when to use the clearing techniques, and what is the effect of those clearing techniques on hospitalizations and infections? There's some indication that it may reduce the number of hospitalizations and infections if you use the pulmonary clearance techniques. And what's the effect on your respiratory status? How can we maximize NIV? How do we get people to be more compliant? About 70% of people who start on non-invasive ventilation tolerate it, but 30% don't. How do we get that 30% to be able to use it and use it effectively, since we know it helps with survival and quality of life? And what should the settings be? What ventilator should we use? How do we titrate and follow non-invasive ventilation to make sure we're doing it the best way we can? All of these are areas that need exploration. because we can make this even better if we do the right things and we learn more about it. And then finally, how do we best strengthen and maintain the muscles of respiration? What's the best way to do that expiratory muscle training that I talked about, and breath stacking? These are important areas and gaps that need to be filled. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, thank you. So then nutrition. We know that prognosis is directly related to your BMI at the start, and maintaining weight increases survival. And there's evidence that certain diets can slow the disease down. And in fact, there's been a study with feeding tube where, as we lose weight and swallowing function is affected and our breathing muscles weaken, people with ALS are often given a feeding tube. And this has been shown to improve quality of life and survival. And in fact, there's a study that showed certain types of feeds can improve survival when used in that feeding tube. And let's not forget something that's really hot now, and that's the gut-brain microbiome, interaction in the microbiome that may be driving neuroinflammation that drives disease, and certainly been implicated in Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative diseases. And now in ALS, it's been shown in the animal model, if you change the feed, you can change the course of the disease. It's also, and now we're in the process of examining the microbiome in people with ALS and dietary changes, but those are gaps. Next slide. And so what are the effects of different diets on disease, and what are the effects of changes to the microbiome? Can we change the microbiome? What's the effects of starting tube feeds earlier? Not waiting until somebody absolutely needs a feeding tube, but giving them a feeding tube early to maintain optimum nutrition. What about supplements? Are there supplements that could actually help? Certainly we all read about them, but how do we study them in a rigorous way to see what really makes a difference? Next slide. Next, I wanted to talk a little bit about supporting caregivers and the burden of disease. This is a family affair. The whole family is affected. Spouse, children, friends, the care network. Next slide. And, as the disease progresses, there's more and more needs and more stress and burden. And it's even harder when there's cognitive involvement. We know that 10% of folks with ALS can have major cognitive involvement and frank dementia, and up to 40% have some cognitive involvement. And when that occurs, it's even more frustrating and more difficult for families. And there's been little research. We've been researching all over the place about cognitive involvement and the burden of disease, but there's been little research on how do we relieve the level of burden for caregivers and families of people living with ALS in a constructive way, and relieve the stress in people living with ALS. What are the best ways to do that? That's a huge need. Next slide. So in summary, we know ALS is relentlessly progressive. We have two disease-modifying agents, riluzole and radicava, but there's still so much that can be done to alleviate disease, help maximize function and independence, and even survival, while we look for additional medicines and something called biomarkers, ways to stratify disease. And we need more of those, and I'm sure you've heard about that, the search for ways to stratify people into different trials and to know what to treat someone with, and to be able to diagnose disease early. So biomarkers of disease, these are important, and it's important to do research there. But it's also important to maximize the tools we have now. We know good respiratory care and nutrition can make a huge difference in survival and quality of life. But still, there's all these unanswered questions. We can do better, and we can increase the effects of these interventions on the complications of ALS, reduce hospitalizations, reduce infections, and prolong life. And we know that there's a huge burden of ALS on not only people living with ALS, but their caregivers and families. And now's the time to consider how we can reduce that, what we can do about it. thank you very much for your time and listening to something I'm really passionate about and could have talked about for an hour, but thank you.
Well, Dr. Hyman Patterson, I think we could have listened to you for an hour, and really appreciate your time and insight today. A couple questions. The survival and quality of life benefits that you talked about are so meaningful. What are some policies that can be put in place to make sure that that everybody has access to these interventions?
Well, I think there's several things. One is to make sure that people living with ALS get to appropriate care paradigms, to multidisciplinary clinics and people who are knowledgeable. There needs to be education in the pulmonary community for pulmonologists who don't care for ALS folks about the advantage of non-invasive ventilation and also pulmonary toileting. I find that those clearance modalities are not used as much as I think they should be. And of course, getting insurance to pay. For instance, Medicare will cover either a percussion vest or a coughlator, but not both. Now, some of that has been solved because there are ventilators that'll do both non-invasive ventilation and, for instance, vest, the percussion. So then you can get that ventilator if you can get insurance to pay for it, along, then with the coughlator. So, so you can combine things and you get all the modalities you need. We need some, we need more research monies that sort of, I don't want to call it mundane because it's not, but people look at it as these funding these kinds of projects that look at optimizing care as more mundane, but it isn't. People have to understand I can make a bigger difference in your survival using non-invasive ventilator properly than anything we have today. So more attention to funding this type of research and the importance of it, and funding multidisciplinary clinics, because that's a whole nother area, which is that multidisciplinary clinics often struggle with the finances, and people living with ALS and their families struggle with finance of out-of-pocket expenses. I mean, I'm sure you've been talking about this the whole time here, that this is a major issue. So, certainly if we could have some legislation that kind of helps with the funding to optimize these areas, payment for the modalities when implemented properly, and help for people living with ALS to be able to have all this in the house, the copays. I've had people send back their ventilators because of copay. I'm not sure I answered your question, but.
Perfectly. Yeah, no, it was great. I'm glad we asked it and got to learn more. Question about some of the resources that you shared. Where can folks find the information on some of the nutrition and diet plans that you talked about?
Well, that's the problem, is we don't know the best nutrition and diet plans. And, you could certainly Google nutrition in ALS and get some papers on it. But what is the best? That's the big gap. We know that it can make a difference. If you want to read the academic articles, you can go to PubMed and just put it in, and you can put microbiome in ALS and get something back. But it would be important not to just go to some of these websites that say, oh, buy my antioxidants and that'll work. I think this is a huge unmet need, because I do believe there are nutritional changes. For instance, we're beginning to study pro-inflammatory diets and whether or not people who are on pro-inflammatory diets actually accelerate disease, or it has something to do with longevity with the disease if you eat a pro-inflammatory diet. We need objective, good science studying diets in a rigorous way to understand the effects. I'm sure there are effects, but this sort of reaching here and there and, reading about a particular nutrient and hoping that it works because, this protocol or that protocol, we need to study them rigorously.
And a question about respiratory strength exercises. Where can people find information or references to or document to help?
Again, you get probably, you just Google it and you'll come up with the article, and your clinician should be able to sort of get you started on that. There's no particular website you can go to per se, but you can pull up the articles, read about them, and bring them to your clinician that's caring for you to implement it. And these are machines that you buy on Amazon. In fact, you can buy an expiratory muscle trainer on Amazon. So that is one place you can go, but you want to get some guidance on how to use it. And typically, the way you exercise, your expiratory force is measured, how well you can breathe out. And then this machine is set to a percentage of that, and you exercise using the machine, blowing into it in cycles of 10, 3 cycles of 10. That's how we do it, but everybody does it differently. But you need to know what your expiratory strength is, and you can buy one of these machines. They're about $29 on Amazon, but you need guidance using it.
You mentioned caregiver support. What are some things that we can do from a policy perspective, from a societal perspective, to provide more support for caregivers?
Yeah, I mean, okay, you can start by having insurance provide more home health aides. Which gives relief and respite. There's so many ways. We do have caregiver groups. We all know about support groups. Do we study rigorously the effect of support groups? Do they really help burden? And what's the best way to use support groups to help families and caregivers with that burden? But a lot of it, I think, also providing some sort of respite, which means home health aides, some sort of insight into what it means. The other area is, if I choose to go on a ventilator, and about 10% of folks do choose to have a trach in a ventilator program. And this is sort of something that I think is a pet peeve. You're almost positively going to be relegated to going into a nursing home, because while Medicare will pay the cost of a nursing home, it won't give you that money to care for someone at home. And therefore, you really can't take someone home without nursing and without some sort of round-the-clock support, right? And so I think legislation where people could use, could alternatively to leaving their loved one in a nursing home or a facility, event facility, if that money could be directed to the family to take care of the needs and keep someone at home, that's a quality of life issue. If I choose to live, I want to live with my family. I don't want to live in a facility. And that would, of course, reduce burden for people living with ALS, and to families who want to have their loved one at home, having money to pay for nursing and things like that.
I'm gonna try to sneak in one more question. Nutritionists stress the need to keep on weight, but for some slow progressors, becoming overweight after diagnosis can actually be a serious problem. So some of us are trying to lose weight without losing muscle strength. How can that be done safely?
Good question. Well, it can be by making sure you eat proper nutrition and do it slowly, and exercise if you can, if you're able to exercise during that weight loss. I think the real weakness comes when you really become malnourished. It sounds like you're not malnourished if you're a slow progressor and overweight, but BMI makes a difference. And certainly we do advise people to maintain weight. We tell them to eat whatever they want, but I don't know that I'm telling them the right thing, right? Eat milkshakes. I'll say eat butter, put all that stuff on. But is that the best diet? We don't have good information. In fact, there's conflicting information that, a diet high in fat might be better than a diet high in carb, but yet in that study of feeding tubes, high carb, high cal diet worked the best as the feed and prolonged survival. So, what's the best answer? What you point out is the true need for real studies. We do it by the seat of our pants and sort of practicality. We know that BMI makes a difference. We know that people with ALS are hypermetabolic. So we make this advice, but is it the right advice? We don't know. We need more work. If anything comes through, there are these gaps, and we're already making a difference, but we could do better.
Well, we truly appreciate your time, Dr. Hyman Patterson. Thanks for helping us explore ways that we can reduce the harms of ALS. Next up, we have the association's board chair, Scott Kaufman, who recently spoke with Congresswoman Anna Eshoo of California. She's a true champion for ALS. She works tirelessly for people with ALS, and we got to hear what she did last year in passing the Act for ALS and what she's working on this year. And now, direct from Congress with Congresswoman Anna Eshoo.
Hi, I'm Scott Kaufman. I'm the chair of the ALS Association, and I'm delighted to have with me today Congresswoman Anna Eshoo. And for those of you who don't know about Congresswoman Eshoo, or as we like to affectionately say here in the Congressional 18th District in California, Anna. And I say we because that is where I am sitting right now. She is my representative, and I mean that in so many different ways. So a representative in Congress, but also one of the most effective voices to us in the ALS community. Because since 2019, she was the first female chair of the House Energy and Commerce Committee's Health Subcommittee. And that's where a lot of the legislative advancements are made in healthcare and for people living with ALS. So first, Anna, I would be remiss if I just didn't thank you from the bottom of my heart for everything you have done for all of the families that are battling this insidious disease. And I want to let's start on a high note with the excitement that came last year. I'd call it the holiday gift that keeps on giving, the Act for ALS, which was passed right around the holidays in December of last year. I know how hard you worked to get that passed into law. Tell us a little bit more about why that bill is so important.
Well, first of all, Scott, thank you. It's wonderful to be with you and all of the advocates. It's really an honor, and I salute you for your superb leadership of the organization and all of the irreplaceable advocates. It was very, very exciting, the Act for ALS. I would sum it up in just a couple of words. It's given people hope in capital letters. We authorized, that means we approved the legislation that contains $100 million in new grants each year for the next 4 years to support expanded access and research programs. And this will bring investigational treatment to more ALS patients. The new law, as I said, in my view, really represents hope for the 1 in 300 people affected by ALS in our country. And as you said, the passage of the law was, it was really a hard-earned win, for the thousands of ALS advocates. And really, without the advocates, this would not have happened. They fought for the legislation. They spoke to the legislation. They spoke to members. They called. They urged members to be co-sponsors of the legislation. So without all of that work, most people think that Congress is a proactive institution. I thought that when I first ran. I don't know what got into me. It's reactive. Congress reacts to the voices of the American people. But those voices need to be consistent. They need to be informed voices. And it has to be a national effort in every single congressional district. So bravo. It was really a great, great day. And I'm so proud to have been, a part of the effort.
Yeah, it was quite a bipartisan vote, wasn't it? It was so good to see the entire Congress coming together on behalf of our community.
That is a direct result of the work effort that went into this. So if anyone thinks that as one person, they're powerless, that they don't count, disabuse yourself of that notion. This is full proof of the power of people coming together around an issue. And Scott, no patient with ALS no one can say to that patient, you don't know what you're talking about. As one of my constituents said, Congresswoman, I die a little every day.
And that really speaks to the urgency with which we need new and effective drugs and treatments. And I'm sure you know better than most how frustrating it can be to watch a promising new drug get knocked down through the approval process. We're really looking for more innovative ways for the FDA to exercise its promise to our community about regulatory flexibility when it comes to approval of these drugs. The disease is so heterogeneous. It's not clear, which drugs may be working on which patients, but we need a better way to evaluate once a drug is deemed safe. What more can the FDA be doing for us, Anna?
Well, I think we all have the same goal. We want full FDA approval for effective drugs. But the question, I think, before the Congress and the FDA is, how do we best get there? So first, there needs to be clarity and transparency about the FDA standards for approval for deadly, as you said, heterogeneous diseases like ALS with unmet medical needs. I think a promise of flexibility rings hollow when it's undefined. And so this really calls for definition. Secondly, I think we need to better multidiscipline coordination between the FDA, the NIH, the academic researchers across our country, the private drug companies, and patients. Breakthroughs in cancer and HIV, Scott, they came from a better understanding of the basic science of the diseases, but also through better collaboration, through data sharing, and a coordinated strategy. And so I think that this is what's really needed in this effort. And I think that if we can, and we can, there's no such thing as we can't, we need to identify, we need to have definition, we need to have full collaboration across the stakeholders that I just outlined. And I think with that collaboration, we'll bring the breakthroughs that from the bench to the bedside.
If there's a silver lining to the pandemic, it has been the explosion of access and availability of telehealth. And for anyone living with ALS, many of them have significant mobility issues, and telehealth has been a godsend. But I understand that unless Congress acts, people may lose access to telehealth by the end of this year. What can Congress, or what should Congress be doing to preserve access for ALS patients to their clinicians via telehealth?
Well, Scott, I'm very glad that you're raising this issue because it is so important. And I like to refer to telehealth as, a complete success story. It's like lining up the 5 cherries on a machine. It's a win, 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 win. But Congress still needs to do more to make this permanent. There is a very large price tag to it, Scott. And that's really what the leadership is grappling with, because everything that we spend, we have to identify how we're going to pay for it. And so this is a big pay for. Now that Medicare beneficiaries and Americans are receiving this benefit, it's a win. They know that it is. So it's up to us to make sure that it continues to be affordable, that there's a permanency to this. I haven't heard one member of Congress say, don't continue this. So that's the good news. The other good news is that the American people, having experienced it, know how valuable it is. Now we need to make it permanent. So I'm working with my colleagues to make that the case, because this should not fall by the wayside. It isn't all that often where there's one single issue that everyone agrees on. this is one of them.
Well, if that can be our gift to the legislative process, we're happy to offer it up. You've been such a champion, the Act for ALS, ARPA-H, the appropriate measures of pressure on the FDA, on Congress to get this telehealth bill, telemedicine extended. And you began your comments really with my last question, which is you are addressing our advocates, and this is our annual advocacy conference, and the advice that you would give them in addition to every person makes a difference. Any parting thoughts?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me with you today. It's very special to me. It really is an honor. Very often individuals say to me, what is it that I can do? I want to do something, but in so many ways, I feel helpless. And it is the exact opposite of that. I'm not saying this just to make you feel good. I hope I'm making you feel good with some positive messages and the progress that we're making. But the raw fact in this is that without advocacy in our country, it comes up from every community across our country, none of these issues would ever move. But when citizens come together around an issue, and it doesn't happen overnight, I want to say that to everyone. You cannot be discouraged. You don't want me to become discouraged. You would never expect that of me. Well, I don't expect that of you either. And I think that this most recent effort on the legislation should really make you all feel doubly empowered because you all did it. If I didn't have all the advocates behind me, I remember saying to the chairman of the committee, if you don't allow this to progress through the committee with a full vote, I'm going to hold a press conference. And you know who's going to be at the press conference? All the ALS advocates. And I'm going to point to you and say, you won't allow this to move forward. And he said, you would never do that. I said, watch me. So, but it was the power of each one of you, your voices. And as I said earlier, no one can say to any one of you, you don't know what you're talking about. This is a devastating disease. This is the United States of America. Anything is possible in our great nation when we seize the opportunity to make the changes that are absolutely necessary to better people's lives, to give them a long, good life, to give them hope that this can happen. That's what your work is. That's what my work is. And we need each other. So I salute all of you for participating in your very important conference where you share so much, where you build new strategies. Know that as long as the people of this congressional district choose me to represent them, that I will always be your partner. So thank you to all of you. And Scott, again, thank you to your extraordinary leadership.
Thank you. Well, advocates, there you have it. We have the biggest advocate in Congresswoman Anna Eshoo on Capitol Hill for us on the march to make ALS a livable disease. Thank you so much, Anna, from the bottom of our hearts. Next up, Jeremy Holden in our next panel. Jeremy, over to you.
Sorry about that. I have to unmute myself. It is my great pleasure to introduce our next three very special guests, Nirali Shah, Sunny Bruce, and Jesse Ibarra. Nirali Shah is joining us today from New York. She is a corporate attorney at Goodwin Procter LLP's New York office and a member of the Life Sciences and Technology Group. As we approach 7 years from when her mother, Sonal Shah, passed from ALS, it is rewarding for Nirali to work with companies who are developing therapeutics for different diseases. Nirali is a member of the ALS Association's Public Policy Committee and a member of the ALS Association Greater New York Chapter's Board of Directors. Sonny Browse is joining us today from Texas. Since being diagnosed with ALS in 2015, right before her 28th birthday, Sonny has made it her mission to ensure others know they are not alone in the fight against ALS. Sonny is a passionate advocate and has been featured in local and national publications, as well as on her excellent blog, sunnystrong.com. And Jesse Barra is joining us today from California. Jesse's journey with ALS began in 2015. He is a dedicated family man, a United States Air Force veteran, and recently retired from a 32-year career in information technology. Jesse is an enthusiastic advocate, vice chair of the ALS Association's Public Policy Committee, and a member of the ALS Association Greater San Diego Chapter's Board of Directors. Thank you all for being with us today.
Great to be here.
All of you have been outspoken advocates and very public with your ALS journey. So I just want to start off with motivation. What drives you to share your experiences, and why is being an advocate important to you? Roundtable, whoever wants to go first.
Ladies first.
Honey, go for it.
Okay. I like to talk. I am an advocate because my voice matters. And I think that finding that motivation to tell my story, to tell anybody's story when in the fight for ALS, especially when talking about advocacy, it's important that our representatives and elected officials can think back when they go to make those decisions and say, oh yeah, I met Sunny and this is why it's important to her. So that's my motivation.
Nirali?
So people like Sunny and Jesse are my motivation. So it's definitely an honor to share this stage with them, and they're definitely rock stars. And my original motivation came from my mother, Sonal Shah, who passed away from ALS in 2015. She's definitely my driving force. But this is definitely bigger than one person and a few people. It's everyone who's been touched by ALS, whether that's pals or caregivers, medical professionals, researchers. And from the day that my mom was diagnosed, she clearly told my father and me that she did not want to keep the diagnosis to herself. She wanted to share her story with her friends and family and the greater community to spread awareness and to help other pals and families. So that definitely has driven me to continue her legacy. And she did a lot. She wrote a book with one finger since the others were tightly against her palm. She advocated on Capitol Hill when this was in person. And so she really, on a day-to-day aspect, still drives me. And it's important for me to share our story, whether that inspires others to share theirs or for legislators to understand the seriousness of our asks. And ultimately, it's to connect with people, and that's how we can make a change. We as humans are emotionally moved and resonate with others. And when we do that, we're inclined to listen and care and make a difference. And so that's why being an advocate is important to me. It's ultimately to better our ALS community.
And last but not least, Jesse, take it away.
Yeah, so my motivation, I'm sure every other person with ALS that gets given that diagnosis that you have 2 to 5 years to live. I mean, I went into a dark place. I felt like I had no future. I felt like I was given an expiration date. I would look at my 4-year-old son and granddaughter, and I said, you know, I'm never going to see them grow up. And, you know, being in that emotional space, just, you know, that was about a year. And then I did something counterintuitive. I decided to choose my ALS, to accept it, and to find peace with it. because what you resist, you know, keeps persisting. And so then after that, I decided I'm going to read everything I can about this disease. I'm going to learn everything I can about it. I'm going to empower myself from a space of being disempowered. And I did that. I started going to sport group meetings. I started getting involved with like the walk. I got a team together. I got my family, my friends involved. And then it just started snowballing. I started getting excited about making a difference. So my motivation is that I want to live, and I'm not going to go down without a fight. So that's where I'm at.
Well, you're all incredible. You're all incredibly inspiring and amazing. Sonny, engaging legislators in the fight against ALS can be intimidating, especially if someone hasn't done it before, hasn't met a member of Congress and made an ask of them. Do you have any advice for someone new to advocacy to help them maybe feel a little bit more comfortable?
Comfortable shoes. No, my advice is to use the tools that are provided for you. The ALS Association, amongst other organizations, does a really great job of this is who you contact, this is what you're asking, this is how they voted before. This is something, a quirky fun fact to help you connect with them. All those tools are out there. Whether you're trying to meet them in DC or their local offices when they're home on break, or just making phone calls or virtual visits, or even as simple as sending a tweet or an email. The ALS Association does an amazing job of giving you all the tools you need to be as effective and efficient with your time and your asks.
Jesse, you've advocated for so many priorities over the years that have helped the ALS community. Is there a legislative fight or a public policy fight that really resonates with you that really kind of, you know, that you think back on as?
Oh, absolutely. So my first participation in advocacy was traveling to DC in 2019 when we were still in person. One of our asks was to eliminate the 5-month waiting period for people with ALS to access their Social Security benefits. I'm proud to say that our efforts paid off, and with the passing of the ALS Disability Insurance Access Act in 2020, it actually paid off for me because this year, in March 23rd, I chose to stop working. And from the time I submitted my claim to I had a retroactive deposit in my bank account was 10 weeks. Now, 10 weeks is a long time, but it's better than 5 months. And I still think the administration could do better. And I'm going to be advocating for that as well. But that has personally helped me, and it's proof that advocacy works.
Nirala, you talked about joining the ALS community as a caregiver for your mother, and unfortunately, she, as you mentioned, she passed in 2015. Why is it important to you to continue raising awareness and advocating for ALS?
Yeah, so for me, my dad and my mom, our lifeline was our support network. So it's important to me to continue raising awareness about ALS because I would like to create the same support structure for those affected by ALS. And the more people that know about the disease and that are focused on creating a treatment and ultimately a cure, the better. And I think knowledge is key. So, and as we know, pals and caregivers alike go through a lot. So if family members, friends, and neighbors have even a little bit of insight into what PALs and caregivers are going through. It could greatly help each individual's situation. But we need each other to get through that together. So it's important to me to also advocate so our legislators and playmakers alike can take action. We have some way to go, but if we continue to fight together, we can make a change in honor and in memory of all of our loved ones.
Talk to me a little bit about, for the group, Sunny, you talked earlier about, you want your lawmakers, you want your representatives to say, oh, Sunny told me this, and talk to me about the importance of personal storytelling as part of advocacy.
I have always approached it in the sense of adding my face to the fight. I don't look like your typical ALS patient. I don't fit the demographic. I don't fit the age group. I don't even fit the gender of your typical ALS diagnosis. So to be able to go in and say, my life is worth fighting for, and this is what I still have in front of me, I think it just makes that story that much more powerful, rather than looking at the vote just by numbers or as a big picture. Really personifying the ask and letting them know that their decisions are impacting people like me.
We talked earlier, we heard from Kyle Zebley, the informative talk about the fight for telehealth access. And he talked about gridlock in Washington, D.C. And, it strikes me that some of these legislative fights can take time. And one of the words that we always talk about is urgency. So I'm curious how you deal with the long period of time, seemingly endless fight for incremental change or vast change. How do you stay motivated knowing that it takes some repetition and it takes some doggedness and determination?
I'll take that. It's very frustrating. This AMLX, not being pushed out, very, very frustrating. The issues with Neuron, but you gotta keep yourself motivated. You gotta keep pushing. You gotta keep your support system around you engaged, because the squeaky wheel gets the oil, and we've got to squawk and be loud and be noticed, and have them really take a look.
Well, this has been great. And I've said this so many times over the course of the last few days. I could sit here and talk to you all for hours, but unfortunately, in the interest of time, we are going to have to leave it there. Jesse, Nirali, Sunny, thanks so much for your time and your insight today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, everyone, it's time to move into the next phase of our programming. And in order to do that, I'm going to welcome back Melanie Lindenall.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. It's great to be back with everyone today. The sad news is that we've now come to the final part of the ALS Association's 2022 National ALS Advocacy Conference. But I'm once again going to ask you to take action right now to support our goal of increasing federal funding for ALS research. Throughout the conference, we've heard a lot about the urgent need to increase federal investments in ALS research. So please consider sending a letter to your members of Congress to urge them to support increased investment in ALS research as the FY 2023 appropriations process continues. So go ahead and take out your phone again and scan that QR code on your screen by opening your camera app on your phone, holding your phone so that the QR code appears in the view. Tap that notification to open the link for the QR code. And the QR code will take you directly to our action center where you can complete today's action. Thank you again to each of our speakers and to all of you for joining. Due to our technical difficulties yesterday, we are sharing the rest of our programming that was missed. and invite you to stay if you would like, and then we will officially close the conference. But if you can't stay, don't worry. The recordings will be made available after the conference. And for those staying with us, we will be taking a 10-minute break. And as we go to break, let's hear from yet another ALS champion on Capitol Hill, Congressman Rodney Davis from Illinois.
Hi, I'm Congressman Rodney Davis. Thank you to the ALS Association for letting me be a part of your 2022 National ALS Virtual Advocacy Conference. I'm proud to support more research, treatment, and cures for ALS, and I'm honored to be able to be an advocate for these issues here in Congress. Throughout my time in Congress, I've supported new and increased research and funding for ALS. I've also advocated for healthcare policies that ensure America is on the cutting edge of treatment and innovation so that patients have access to the life-saving drugs that they need. It's really because of your advocacy and raising awareness surrounding these issues that we can find new treatments, cures, and solutions to reduce the harms associated with ALS. I look forward to continuing our work together to ensure patients can access the treatments and solutions that they need. I'm proud to fight ALS alongside you. Have a great conference.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed that break. My name is Kuldip Dave. I'm the head of research here at the ALS Association. And you heard a lot in the last few days from Dr. Benatar, from Dr. Hyman Patterson, from Dr. Bedlack about different aspects of research. And let me put that all in the context for you. How does that all fit into the ecosystem? Next slide, please. So this is the ALS research ecosystem. And if you start all the way on the left here, this is the biology and genetics piece. This is where we try to understand what's different about ALS. What is this? What goes dysfunctional? Why do motor neurons die? And underneath that are risks and causes of ALS. These are the environmental, occupational risks that may be driving an increase in ALS. This on the left is really the foundation of any research. This is where we find out the targets that we need to go after for therapeutic development. So then you get to this middle phase called preclinical drug development. So now you have a target, a biological target to go after, and you start making drugs against that target. And this middle phase is generally where pharma and biotech take over. They develop drugs, they test it. It's essentially bench science. They test it in cells, they may test it in animals, but they test and make sure that the drug is safe before it can come into these next three phases. And I think you all are pretty well versed with the three phases, clinical phases, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. In phase 1, you look for safety, whether the drug is safe in humans. In phase 2, you start to look at efficacy. And in phase 3, you look at efficacy in a larger trial. And once the drug goes through all of these phases, you get to a drug approval, or, so to speak, the drug gets on the pharmacy shelves. And that's the drug development side. On the other side of things, and you heard a lot of this from Dr. Hyman Patterson and Dr. Bedlack, we have a research in what we call managing ALS for people that have ALS today. And this is research into assistive technology, telehealth, telemedicine research, quality of life research, or even patient surveys where we're asking you to provide us with guidance and challenges that you face, whether that's research in caregiver burden or family burden, or even natural history studies, where you just look at how the disease progresses. And underneath it all, you can see is infrastructure piece. And this is really very important. Without that infrastructure, none of this top piece would happen. So just to let you know, the ALS Association is the largest philanthropic funder of ALS research in the world. We currently have 140 active projects and about $48 million committed across 12 different countries. We have, since the Ice Bucket funds, since the Ice Bucket Challenge, committed $120 million in research. And since the inception of our organization, we have committed over $200 million in ALS research. Next slide, please. So let's just take a quicker look at the three phases. And here, I just listed some of the drugs here in each of the three phases that I talked about earlier. And the take-home message here is that we have, I'm only showing you 15 compounds here, but there are more than 50 trials that are happening in our space. That is really exciting. For a relatively rare disease like ours, to have that many trials is a really good thing. And what is really good about, if you look through these drugs, is that they are hitting diverse targets, diverse pathways. Some are going after neuroinflammation, some are going after mitochondria, some are going after oxidative damage. There are also different type of approaches here. You'll see a small molecule compound, you'll see stem cell treatments, you see genetic therapies. And you see that these programs are run by small companies or large companies. So this is really exciting. We want the clinical trial landscape to be as full as possible. Why? Because as you heard earlier with Scott and Representative Eshu, over 90% of drugs fail going through these 3 phases. And so we need more shots on goal. And so the more diversified our pipeline, the better shot that we'll have a success come through into drug approval. Next slide, please. So, you know, I told you there are over 50 trials, but that's not enough. We want to do more. And here's a very holistic approach on how we can increase the number of clinical trials. This is, by the way, part of our strategic plan of making ALS a livable disease. And I'll just walk you through from left to right here, but on the top, we are expanding and increasing funding for preclinical drug development. I talked about this. This is what you do on bench when you test in animals and cells before you go to the humans. We need to do more of that so that we can have more clinical trials. We are also increasing private investment in ALS. We are tracking how many of our programs are actually being handed off or going on and getting investment after our funding. We're also looking and keeping an eye on how many new companies are entering our space or how many new companies are getting venture funding for ALS drug development. We also, as you know, last year launched our own early stage clinical trial program. Very happy to report we funded 4 trials out of that program last year. And we plan to fund more this year as well. And I think what you see on the right here is what my colleagues Melanie and Kathleen and others have been talking about. We cannot do this on our own. We need to expand and increase government funding for ALS trials. And we do so by increasing the Department of Defense's ALS research program funding. We do so by increasing specific funding for the FDA Orphan Products Program. We do so by increasing NIH spending. And we bring changes to the regulatory processes so that we can speed trials and approvals. And then on the bottom here, going from left to right, we also, we're thinking about having more trials, but if we're going to have more trials, we're going to need more trial sites. And so we this year launched a brand new program on clinical trial capacity so that we can increase capacity. And so there could be more trial sites all over America. We're also in the process of developing a trial matchmaker so that we can increase recruitment, because more trials means more trial sites. More trial sites means more people needed for those trials. And finally, we are also enabling widespread genetic testing and counseling so that we can really make sure that if people have particular genetic related ALS, that they get the opportunities to be in genetic trials, or hopefully get opportunities if any of those genetic therapies make it to the clinic. Next slide, please. I think we can skip that slide and go to the one after this, just for the interest of time. And so I just want to end with this slide here. And, this is the most relevant news right now. As you all know, Health Canada, which is sort of our equivalent of the FDA in Canada, has approved AMX0035 as a disease-modifying treatment for ALS. This is, let me tell you a little bit about this. AMX0035 is a combination product of PB and Terso. And it's really a product that's targeting 2 different biological pathways. And it's really important to know that this is one of the first trials that we supported through Ice Bucket funding back in 2016. We provided more than $2 million in early research and clinical development grant to Amylyx. And the history, I think you all know, the phase 2 results are really exciting. They were reported in 2020 and published. And the new drug application was filed in 2021, and there was an FDA advisory committee meeting in 2022. But really the crux of it is that AMX0035 improved ALS-FRSR by 30%. It reduced the progression of the disease, and it improved survival by at least 6 months. And lately there's some data that's showing that it could be as higher as 10 months or more. The FDA had some concerns in that AdCom. However, the committee voted very closely, 6-4, But this is not a binding vote. And, these conversations continue between Amylyx and FDA. But this news about Health Canada's approval is only a reason for us to ask FDA to also have the regulatory flexibility that it has talked about, that we need them to also approve AMX 0035. If their counterparts in Canada can see the same data and can approve the drug based on that data, there's no reason why Americans cannot have access to this drug now while the phase 3 Phoenix trial is ongoing. With that, I would like to end here, but I'll take questions on the other side of this. But we had an opportunity to speak to Dr. Sabrina Paganoni, she's the lead of this program. And let me just really quickly introduce her. She's the associate professor at Harvard Medical School. She's co-director of NCRI Institute and the Healy AMG Center at Mass General Hospital. And she's one of the foremost experts in ALS. She's been funded by NIH, by industry, as well as nonprofits like the ALS Association. And I recorded an interview with her. Please enjoy that recorded presentation, and we'll come back for Q&A later.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. Always great for me to be at this conference. I was there in person a few years ago, just before the pandemic. I always join, even during the virtual events, and I'm really grateful for all the advocacy that all of you do, and especially grateful to the ALS Association for putting together this event. And advocacy matters. Advocacy is so important. So today in my presentation, I want to talk about 3 programs where advocacy has really been a key player. And these are the CENTAR trial, a trial of AMX 35, which recently led to the approval of AMX 35 in Canada. And I'm also going to talk about the Healy ALS platform trial and about expanded access. And again, advocacy has been front and center, really a key player in all these programs. And so thank you so much again for everything you do. And I want to highlight the role of advocacy in all these programs. Let me start by talking about the CENTAR trial. So the CENTAR trial of AMX 35 was developed and conducted in partnership with the ALS community. The trial sponsor and drug manufacturer is Amylyx Pharmaceuticals, a company based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And we partnered with them in around 2015, 2016, even before the study started. We wrote together the design of the trial and submitted the grant to the ALS Association and ALS Finding a Cure. And it was that initial seed grant that was so important to get this trial started. And then after that, the company grew substantially, and it's really been a pleasure to work with them and with all the sites of the NEALS Consortium, which is a consortium of centers of excellence for ALS, and 25 of those sites participated in this trial. And we coordinated the trial from our institution, the Massachusetts General Hospital and the Healy Center for ALS, and it's really been a great collaboration. I do want to emphasize that we had patient representatives on the steering committee. So they really helped us shape the trial. And also more recently, many of you participated in advocacy surrounding AMX 35, which is fantastic. And the trial results, just to summarize them briefly, are that AMX 35 treatment resulted at a positive impact on disease progression and survival, and this was a safe drug. Specifically, there was a 25% slower decline in function in people who received AMX 35 compared to placebo, and there was about a 5-month longer median survival in people who were originally assigned to AMX 35 compared to placebo. I want to emphasize that these results are on top of standard of care, which is listed at SOC on the slide. So it's very important to note that here we are trying to add to standard of care, meaning Riluzole and Edaravone, because we want to continue to provide added value to people living with ALS. And so these positive results led to a number of outcomes. Specifically, as you may have heard just a few days ago, the drug was approved in Canada, so it will be available in Canada first. So congratulations on that achievement. And then in the US, we are waiting for the final decision from the FDA that's expected by September 29th of this year. And again, I want to thank everyone who provided testimonies at FDA events, who wrote letters, or participated in advocacy in collaboration with the ALS Association and other groups, I Am ALS and others. And again, this is really a community effort, and we are eagerly waiting the FDA decision. At the same time, there is a second trial. So all of these regulatory discussions are based on the previous trial, the center trial that I led SPI in collaboration with Dr. Sukovic and the NILS Consortium. And now there is a second trial called Phoenix, which is a follow-up trial. That's a global trial, a phase 3 trial that's already underway, mostly recruiting in Europe. So the European Medicines Agency requires longer trials for approval. And so, that trial is also required for, global impact of the drug. And I want to switch gears and talk about another trial, a large-scale trial that's ongoing right now, that's sponsored by the Healy Center for ALS and Mass General. Dr. Sukovic is the PI, and I'm the co-principal investigator. As you can see, there are many, many different logos on the slide. And the reason for that is that this is a fantastic community collaboration with several partners, both from academia, industry, and the patient community, including the ALS Association. And so really we wanted to come together to start testing drugs in a way that's even more efficient. Again, we are very excited about the previous trial, the trial that I just spoke about, the central trial, but now we want to continue to build from that, really expand, use similar patient-centric design features, but now make the trial process even more efficient. And how are we going to do that? Well, we built the first platform trial for ALS. And really the reason we're doing this is because compared to a traditional trial, doing platform trials instead of regular standalone trials cuts the time it takes to develop new drugs by 50%. It cuts the costs and also reduces placebo, which is so important for ALS. And the idea came from the Healy Center, and when Mr. Healy, who was a very successful businessman, very innovative in his field, when he was diagnosed with ALS and Dr. Sukovic became his physician, he thought that the field was too slow. And again, as an expert and successful businessman, he realized that there needed to be something else, a new way of doing drug development. And so he gave a transformative donation that enabled us to start the Healy ALS platform trial. And we learned from oncology that this different type of study design can really make the field faster. In a nutshell, what this means is that we're testing multiple drugs in parallel, not in the same person, but in parallel groups of people. And so right now, instead of testing one drug at a time, we're testing 5 drugs at the same time, and we're sharing the infrastructure. So that's the key. Normally, in a traditional trial, you test one drug at a time, and every drug is tested kind of in a silo, in a unique infrastructure that doesn't really have connections with other drugs. And in this case, instead, we brought together the entire community. As I said, there's many supporters to be able to test multiple drugs at the same time. And the reason we can do that is because we share the same infrastructure. And we also share a placebo group. And this is why we can also reduce the number of people who are on placebo. Now, we opened right after the pandemic started, obviously not the best timing for this. That said, the enrollment rates have been phenomenal. And this is really a testament to the dedication of ALS patients and their families who really want the research to continue despite the circumstances. Also, a testament to the dedication of the clinical sites of the NILS Consortium that have been bringing people in, even though there were obviously disruptions to clinical operations due to the pandemic. And so we opened in July 2020. We've been testing 5 drugs. We enrolled over 900 participants and over 400 enter the open label extension, which means that at the end of the placebo-controlled trial, people can receive drug long-term until we had the results for these drugs. Now, most of the regimens have already completed enrollment, but we are actively enrolling in the last regimen, the one labeled in pink here, the regimen testing 3 LOs. So again, there are more spots if people are interested and more enrollment opportunities. What's very important is also that we're not stopping here. This is a perpetual adaptive trial, meaning that we are continuing to put new drugs into the system. And that's how we're accelerating the testing of new drugs. As I said earlier, again, very excited about the approval of oral edaravone a few weeks ago. Certainly really excited about the approval of AMX35 in Canada, but we need to continue to develop new drugs. And that's why we need to continue to do the work with trials such as this one. Now we are enrolling at a number of sites throughout the US. Another mission of this trial is to really bring the trial close to where people live for greater access. And the results of the first regimens will be available in the summer, fall of 2022. So again, this is a sort of a high throughput trial where we want to continue to develop new drugs and adding more. So we are adding regimens number 6 and 7, and we will continue to add new regimens over the next few years. Now, I want to end by talking about expanded access. Now, the trials I mentioned so far, the Centaur trial of AMX35, the Healy platform trial, all of those trials have some eligibility criteria. And so that means that only people with certain characteristics can participate. Now, we try to make those trials as broadly accessible as possible. That said, it is true that unfortunately not everyone can participate. Now, clinical trials like the ones I just mentioned are incredibly important, and they are really the only way to tell if a new drug is effective. That said, we need to be able to find ways to give more access to investigational products also to people who don't qualify for participation in a clinical trial. And so it was from advocacy, from your feedback, that we worked together with men in the community to develop expanded access. So expanded access is a relatively new concept in ALS. It's been used in other fields of medicine for a number of years. It's an FDA-regulated path. And EAPs, or expanded access protocols, allow investigators to give access to investigational products to people who don't qualify for participation in a clinical trial. They should not interfere with clinical trials, but they can be helpful because they can also allow us to gather some data in a broader population that's normally not considered, again, in formal trials. So this is, again, relatively new. We're working with several colleagues in this field, in this space, and the recent legislation, the Act for ALS, is providing a framework for funding to allow more of these protocols to be developed. And in fact, we are applying for funding for new protocols as well. So far at our hospital, we have had good experience with EAPs. We had a number of single center EAPs. What that means is that we enrolled for a first set of EAPs starting in 2018. We enrolled over 160 participants, again, giving them access to 14 new drugs. And we actually learned a lot from these efforts, and we are submitting a number of papers for publication to share our experience. We also developed an EAP companion to the platform trial, the previous trial I just mentioned, because we wanted to sort of include more sites. So not just our site, but we wanted to include more Neil's sites in this new concept of expanded access. And so for this companion, we have enrolled 8 sites so far with 3 drugs that are part of the platform trial and about 65 participants so far, but we are continuing to enroll. Now, these initial efforts, our initial experience with EAPs was funded by philanthropy, by private donations and fundraising events. And it was more like a grassroots movement that really was supported by patients and advocacy, people like you who wanted to help us give access to these drugs to other people. But now we are also, on top of this, we are also applying for grants from the federal government to try to expand expanded access even further. Now, to conclude, I think this is a very productive time in ALS research. In fact, we never had as many trials in ALS as we have now. We have a robust drug pipeline. This drug pipeline is growing. What that means is that thanks to scientific discovery and scientific experiments, we are developing even more new drugs that then can be tested in trials. We're also setting up better trials, more innovative, more efficient trials than in the past, again, to change the pace of drug development. And it's not just trials, it's also new models of access, such as EAPs, to allow greater access and inclusion for more people with ALS. And throughout all of these, again, your feedback, the engagement of the ALS patient community has been absolutely critical. And so I just want to end by thanking all of you for everything that you are doing. Really, advocacy matters, and we're already starting to see positive results. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Paganoni. Dr. Paganoni, would you be open to maybe answering a couple of questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, thank you for that presentation. It is so relevant in what's happening right now in the world with Canada approving AMX 0035. It's just extremely exciting times. Just on that, maybe one question is, there is some new data that you and the Amylyx team has put out recently in the last couple of months around survival, around complications that were reduced by AMX 35. We also know that the FDA has pushed back the date, the PDUFA date, from what was June 29 to September 29, so that they can review more of that data. And given that there is a Canadian approval, what does that tell you about the American approval? Does that say, is this good news? Is this something that you think can help? The fact that FDA is taking its time, more time, and that another regulatory agency in Canada has approved the drug. Just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, what I can say is that as principal investigator in collaboration with Amylyx Pharmaceuticals, we have continued to look at the data from every possible angle. So over the last year or so, we continued to look at the effects of AMX 35. And as you said, we recently published evidence supporting the fact that AMX 35 also improves a number of other key events, such as time that people are free from ventilation, right, or time to first hospitalization. And we did also some predictive modeling to really better figure out the effects of the drug. So all of this work continues and has continued in the background. Again, in parallel to advocacy, we have also continued to analyze the data, and I'm very glad that this is now in front of the FDA and they can consider that in addition to all the recent developments. So again, I cannot speculate in terms of the final outcome. That said, I think that I'm pleased that the FDA has been thoughtful in terms of considering the new data, and so I think that the delay on the date of decision again is because of a number of factors, and I think overall, hopefully, all of these will contribute to a positive outcome.
Yeah, and just so that everybody knows in the audience, the ALS Association is asking the FDA to take their Canadian counterparts, cue and signal on this and approve the drug. If the data are enough for one regulatory agency, then they should be good enough for the FDA. Just a quick question, Dr. Paganoni, on the HEALEY trials. When do we expect to add new treatments? I know that these 5 were the first first ones that were selected when the platform trial was launched. When do the next set of 5 or 3 or 2 get selected and started?
Yeah, great question. So we are already working on setting up the next 2. And so I expect them to be available either by the end of the year or early 2023. And again, the idea is to have a sort of a continuous process, right? Before, the old way of doing things was to test one drug at a time, which also means that there were gaps. And so every year we would only have the result from one drug, because then it would take time to test the next one. And here instead we have a high throughput process where we can continue to add. So that's that's the goal. One thing, if you allow me, that I didn't mention during the presentation, there's another second goal of the trial, which is very important. So the number one goal, the primary goal, obviously, is to develop new drugs in a faster and more efficient way. But then we also want to take this opportunity to learn more about ALS, because we realize that we also need to develop better biomarkers, better outcome measures, better ways of doing trials. And so the trial is in itself a learning opportunity, and that's why it's adaptive. It can continue to grow and change based on new knowledge that we generate or others generate. And in return, we also want to share all of this knowledge with others. And so the drug companies now are contributing some funds to the trial to test their drug. But there's also another great goal, important goal of the trial, which is to generate new biomarkers, new genetic evidence, again, new knowledge about ALS that's also funded by foundations such as the ALS Association or other groups. And again, because it's not just about developing new drugs, but it's about learning more about ALS so that we can do better in the next iteration.
I think I've said this before, Sabrina, that I was very, and in a good way, pleasantly surprised by how well the platform trial recruited over, the pandemic era. I mean, just when the Healy trial was starting up, that's when the pandemic hit, and yet it's one of the most, rapid recruiting trials that you've had. Over 800 people already in the trial. It's just really impressive and really exciting.
Well, I would say that that's because, first of all, of obviously the dedication of the patient community. And I do want to give a shout out to our patient advisors. We have great patient advisors, fantastic advisory committee. And obviously we welcome input from anyone who is on the call. And really, we really learn a lot from them. And they also gave us great advice in terms of, how to really design the trial and run the trial in a way that's patient-centered. The trials should be activities that people want to participate in. And so we need to continue to add features to it to make it more accessible, more inclusive, and more sustainable. And so thanks to their support and their feedback, we continue to try to do that.
Yeah, and you made a point, Dr. Paganoni, about testing them quickly. It's not just to save time and speed, but if things are not working, we want to quickly test them and say, okay, this doesn't work, let's put it aside, so that there's more room for resources to be put into another new experimental therapy coming down the pipe. So this is really exciting. One final question on the expanded access piece. Can you comment on how, Act for ALS was passed last year by President Biden, and or was it earlier this year? I forget the time.
December, yeah.
It was December, thank you. And people always wonder, well, what does that mean? When can I get into an expanded access regimen? And so I know that now the NIH has launched the RFA, where folks like yourself can go and apply for expanded access. So, can you talk about that and, quickly about sort of how, now that RFA is out, what does that provide you? What kind of opportunity does that open up? And why is that RFA so important? People are trying to understand what is that funding going to?
Yeah.
So, it would be great to hear from you.
Yeah, so the Act for ALS has different dimensions, but a large part of the funding goes to fund expanded access. So it's not just that, but a large portion of it is to fund expanded access. And so the way the money is distributed is basically by a competition, if you will, like a request for applications for grants, which is actually going on right now. In fact, the deadline for applying is this week on Friday. So in fact, I am trying to, actively working on that, as are my colleagues.
You're not sleeping. That's
yes, this week is busy. This week is busy because we really want to submit as many proposals as possible that are solid, and hopefully at least a few of them will be funded. As I presented earlier, at our center, we were fortunate to have private donations and philanthropy funds that allowed us to do initial expanded access protocols. And we have enrolled a good number of people, and we expanded to other sites as well. That said, the level of funding that's required to really make this available at several sites, we're talking of dozens of sites across the US, that requires more substantial funding, and that's where the Act for ALS can come in. And so we'll see, I believe that we will know in September, which proposals will be awarded. And again, whether it's our proposals or other proposals, again, the good news is that there will be expanded access opportunities thanks to this funding in the next few months. Yeah.
That's great. By the way, I didn't know it was as early as September, so that's really good.
Yeah, in terms of how these things go, having the money appropriated for this fiscal year,
right,
and then having it distributed, that's as fast as it gets
right,
from consider that the law didn't even exist until late December. So, to distribute that so quickly is, these proposals are very complex. They are hundreds of pages. So that's why, it's obviously a complex process, but I think it's going as fast as possible. I know it's never as fast as we would like, but again, people are really trying to push this forward as quickly as possible.
Yeah. Well, that's great. And, I want to end it here. I want to be respectful of your time, but Dr. Paganoni, thank you so much. This was a really great presentation. The way you went from, sort of the news of the day, AMX 35, and then moving to the Healy Center and then expanded access. You really gave the audience a full view of our clinical pipeline and what's going on there. So this is really exciting. I really want to thank you for accepting and offering to speak to our audience at this advocacy conference. And thank you for taking my impromptu questions at the very end.
No, this is wonderful. Really love this conference. Again, thank you to the ALS Association and to all of you who are really doing great work. And it's really a great community, very collaborative. And so I'm really hopeful for the next steps.
Welcome back, everybody. As you'll see, I'm joined here with Dr. Kuldip Dave and Dr. Neil Thacker for one more round of Q&A. Doctors Thacker and Dave, thanks for being with us and for your time. Lots of great questions coming in, so let's just kick it right off. So even for non-ALS funded research, drugs, therapies, does the ALS Association put forth resources to support such drugs through the FDA approval process, provided the drugs are safe and effective?
I'm not sure I understand the question. We don't support the filing of a drug through the FDA. That's something the sponsor has to do. Is that what the question is, Jeremy? Can you say more? Maybe
I think it is getting to when a drug is going through the FDA approval process. What is the association's role?
Yeah, we don't have an official role in that process. The FDA is not allowed to share any information with anyone other than the applicant sponsoring organization. So in cases where it looks like the process is running into trouble, we do engage with the FDA directly. We do engage with the community and ask them to engage with the FDA, as we did with the Amylyx drug. But when the process is going smoothly or things seem to be working well, we don't, as in the case for the recent approval of the oral formulation of Radicava.
Great. So we have a question about access to clinical trials and the ability for someone who has an ALS for 4 years or more. How are they able to participate in clinical trials? What's being done to make sure that that's possible? Or
yeah, I could take this, Jeremy. There should be opportunities for someone who has had ALS for a few years to be in trials, and whether that's in interventional trials or observational studies. This is one of the reasons why the expanded access bill that was passed, Act for ALS, could be helpful for people who are not able to get into trials because they were not included from, the inclusion criteria was such that they were not able to participate in the trial itself. So, one of the ideas is that the sooner you can
get in, I think Dr. Benatar talked about this. If we can start to learn, the earliest signs of ALS, and if we can intervene as early as possible, that hopefully we can even prevent someone from advancing to that late stage. I know we're not there yet, but it's good that there are approaches like that already being tested.
Timely question, given what's going on with both oral edaravone and obviously the FDA decision making on AMX35. But a number of insurance carriers have 6-month or more waiting periods before they will cover newly approved drugs. We're seeing that the questioner says with oral edaravone, likely we'll see it with AMX if it's approved, and that is too slow. So what can we do to move that process along?
Yeah, that's a great question. Insurance companies don't always have waiting periods per se, but they have fixed periods of the year when they update their formularies. So it's not so much that they're waiting for 6 months, it's just that they haven't gotten around to updating their formularies. Most insurance companies and Medicare have a specific process where the doctor can request for a drug to be covered that is not on the formulary. And that's a standard procedure, but it can be different for every for every insurer, and that can be confusing for the physician. So the companies, and we've been talking with MT Pharma, and we're starting these conversations with Amylyx as well, have patient assistance programs that can help navigate that system and offer the patient advice on how to access the drug and even intervene with the doctor and the insurer. So I would recommend if they're trying to get, I'm assuming this is about oral edaravone, if they're trying to get that drug version, that they should talk to the company directly and see if the company can offer any direct benefit.
Great. Jeremy, another thing, just to add to this, another thing we are doing at the association is developing a toolkit that payers understand. Payers are seeing hundreds of diseases, and we want them to understand ALS because if they understand it, they identify it, they understand what the disease is, that when they are making payer decisions, that they can take that into consideration. So we are now working to develop these resources and tools with the idea that they would then we would be indulging these payers and liaising with them and getting these resources to them so that they understand ALS, they understand the unmet need and the atrocious nature of the disease, and so that when they are weighing decisions on benefits and coverage, that they can take that into consideration.
Thanks for that. We have a question from someone who says they keenly miss in-person ALS support group meetings. Any indication on when those might resume?
Yeah, I think we're watching the data. So I got an email from the head of our care services program this morning about COVID infection rates. And as long as they're high, we're going to try and keep things virtual. As they start to come down, or we can find safer ways for us to gather, we're going to do that. But we also do want to keep a virtual option because it does offer flexibility to folks who have trouble traveling, either because of distance or mobility issues. I think we need to have both.
I'm going to sneak in one last question here. Point of clarification, or somebody wants a point of clarification from something that Dr. Hyman Patterson said about roughly 1 in 350, 1 in 400 people will get ALS. How does that, what implicate, or does that suggest that the number 30,000, the rough estimate, does that suggest that that's an undercount? How are those two numbers? How do they communicate to each other, I guess?
Well, I can take a start at this, Kolab, if you like. Unfortunately, the length of life for people with ALS is so short that that 30,000 number, which is a recent estimate from the CDC, suggests that people are getting diagnosed, and then a certain number of people are also passing away. And because of that, that number turns out to be apparently around 30,000. Hopefully, as new treatments come online, as we're able to better implement some of the care practices that Dr. Hyman Patterson was talking about, people are going to live longer. And as they live longer, that number is going to increase. And so that's how those things start to balance out. But a lifetime incidence rate and a national prevalence rate are fairly different. And the length of life is a key driver for those differences.
Yeah, thanks for clearing that up. And a couple more great questions that we unfortunately do not have time for, but we'll try to get answers out, offline after the conference. But now I am very pleased to welcome Steve Kowalski, a father, a passionate ALS advocate, and a person living with ALS, so he can share more about why he is involved in ALS advocacy and how he works to make a difference.
Thank you, Jeremy, and to the ALS Association for inviting me to speak for a few minutes this afternoon. I'm a person living with ALS. I was diagnosed in August of 2017. And so as I approach my 5-year mark, I'm super grateful that I was diagnosed early and I was able to get on treatments early, as we've heard from others, that it's critically important to do that. I come to you from Boston, Massachusetts, and like many of you, I'm a fierce advocate in the ALS community. I was asked to speak about advocacy in action. So I looked up the word advocacy in the dictionary because I love to do things like that. And it's a noun. I prefer to look at advocacy as a verb. It's an action. And we as advocates are in action, asking our elected officials to take action. So I thought I would focus my quick talk with you on 3 areas: why I advocate, what I've learned so far, and in my view, what the future looks like moving forward. So simply put, I advocate because I'm a very competitive person. You can't live in Boston without being a sports fanatic, which I am. And I also had a career in sales, which forced me to be competitive. So I took that passion of being competitive, and I look for wins as I advocate. And I look at wins as getting to a desired result with our elected officials and getting things over the finish line. My first advocacy effort was back in 2019 when I attended what was now the last conference in person, and in Washington, D.C. And I just really felt a sense of community with all of the folks that came from all over the country to descend upon Capitol Hill and tell our stories. And at that moment in time, it was pivotal for me because at that point, I felt like I was for the first time able to have some control over a disease that has taken so much physical control away from me. So I think agency is just so important in advocacy work. On a personal note, I'm very involved because I know my 3 children are watching me navigate ALS, and I really want them to learn that you never give up no matter what life throws at you. Most important is I feel our stories matter. Our collective stories matter even more and are incredibly influential. At times, it's difficult to be vulnerable and talk about our struggles. But in my opinion, the saddest stories are those that are left untold. So what have I learned so far? I have learned that whether it's our elected officials, regulatory officials, researchers, scientists, or whoever, in order for them to truly understand what it's like to live with ALS, there's no way for them to know unless we are telling them our story and reminding them that story, and yes, reminding them again and again. It's ongoing. And the last 3 days have proven that there is just so much to do. Advocacy for me is not just working with our elected officials. I have the fortune of living here in Boston, where there's a very large life sciences community and lots of different pharmaceutical companies that are in the ALS space. I've done a lot of work as patient speakers at various pharmaceutical companies, and it really helps them as either they're bench workers or they're in the administrative side of the company to hear my story and to get to know someone with ALS. You'd be surprised that many folks in the pharmaceutical space or companies don't actually ever get to meet a person with ALS. So I go in and I put a face to the disease. I also have done a lot of patient advocacy work with pharmaceutical companies in designing trials. They often convene a group of patients together, and we provide input as they look at designing trials. So that's another form of advocacy that I work hard on. I've also learned that advocacy is not for the quick-minded, those that want quick results. This takes time, a highly coordinated effort, and the ALS Association does a great job of keeping us on track, and I'm thankful for that. Like I said, 2019 was the last year we were all together at the conference in person. Since then, it's been virtual, and what I've learned is that although it's not ideal, it still is effective and it works. Since I've become involved, we have all accomplished great things. We've heard all of our accomplishments, whether it's through Medicare improvements, through additional research, and even Act for ALS. And we all should be very proud, and it should motivate us to want to continue to do even more. So a few things about where I think we are headed. As we look at the pipeline of drug development that is robust currently, I think we're going to have to do a lot more advocating at the FDA level. MLX is a good example of that. I was happy to provide public comment during the advisory panel a few months ago, and many of you joined me in that effort, and it was a powerful day. We may not have gotten the desired result, but our collective stories and our passion that came through during that hearing really makes a difference. As it's been mentioned many times, ALS is a livable disease, will require more services. Many of the services that will be required really aren't delivered at the federal level. So state advocacy, in my opinion, is becoming more important. And we are off to a good start here in Massachusetts in that effort. I also have recently been asked to serve on the ALS Association Public Policy Committee. Myself, along with other pals, are part of the planning group to set advocacy priorities moving forward. And I can tell you state advocacy is a key focus of that area. I was also invited to participate in the 2022 NIH ALS strategic planning process. I'm currently serving on one of the 5 work groups, and the work group that I'm working on is improving the quality of life for persons living with ALS. The final plan will be made public in October, so I encourage you all to stay tuned on that, but also provide us a blueprint for some of our advocacy efforts moving forward. Finally, when we go back to in-person advocacy next year, I hope we can adopt a hybrid approach to involve as many people living with ALS and caregivers as possible, so that we can have a combination of those attending virtually and in person. So to recap, that's why I advocate. That's what some of the things I've learned so far in my view on the advocacy efforts moving forward. So lastly, I just want to thank everybody who has been a part of this process, and most importantly, my fellow pals that continue to do this hard work and make a difference every day. And so I'll end by saying, go Celtics tonight in the NBA Finals. I'll send it back to you, Melanie.
Thank you so much, Steve. It's always great to hear from you. What a great 3 days this has been. But now I want to thank you for an amazing and inspiring advocacy conference. These are some of the most critical conversations happening around ALS today, and we sincerely hope that you feel as energized as we do about making transformational change. And if nothing else, we hope that you know how important your voice is in this fight. Advocacy matters. Your advocacy matters, and is what has and what will move that needle towards making ALS a livable disease. And by all working together, we are confident that we can do it. We need to find new treatments and cures and ensure that patients are able to access them as quickly as possible. We need to optimize current treatments and care by investing in state-of-the-art multidisciplinary care and ensuring access to permanent telehealth services so that all patients, regardless of where they live, are able to access the care they need. We need to prevent or delay the harms of ALS and ensure that all ALS patients have affordable access to the care they need. And we need to prevent, and all of this is attainable. We just have to work together to do it. So finally, I'd like to thank some people who made this all possible. First, I'd like to thank everyone who helped lead the conversations over the last few days. Thank you to the association staff working behind the scenes to make this event happen. Thank you to all our sponsors who are committed to making ALS a livable disease. Thank you to all the caregivers who work so tirelessly to take care of your loved ones. You never receive enough credit, but please know that we see you and we know that you are heroes. Finally, thank you for joining us for this important event. We look forward to continuing this fight together with you. Thank you.